The officer slid the door shut with a sound like a gavel coming down, and Mateo pressed his palm flat against the steel wall of the deportation van, feeling the heat radiate through the metal even though it was February. He'd said his name 14 times that day, his real name, the one on his birth certificate locked in his apartment 3 states away, but no one had written it down correctly, not once. And now the engine was running, and the man beside him was crying into his sleeve, and Mateo realized with a cold, airless clarity that he was about to lose everything he'd ever known because someone else had made a mistake. A clerical error. A flagged name that wasn't his. He closed his eyes and tried to remember his mother's voice, the way she used to say his full name when he came home late, soft and worried, and wondered if he'd ever hear an American accent again. The warehouse in Tucson had smelled like cardboard and diesel fuel, and Mateo had been moving pallets of canned goods when the audit team arrived. He'd worked there for 3 years, long enough to know the rhythm of the forklifts and the way the afternoon light slanted through the high windows, turning the dust gold. He'd been good at his job, quiet, reliable, the kind of worker supervisors forgot about in the best way. But that Tuesday in February, 2 agents in Navy windbreakers had walked through the loading dock with clipboards, and by the time the shift ended, Mateo was sitting in a white-walled room with no windows, answering the same questions over and over. Mateo Reyes, the first agent had said, not looking up from her screen. Born in Hermosillo, Sonora. Entered unlawfully in 2009. No, Mateo had said, keeping his voice level even though his pulse was hammering in his ears. Mateo Reyes, born in Phoenix, Arizona, St. Joseph's Hospital. I can get my birth certificate. It's at my apartment. I can call my landlord. But the woman had only tapped her screen, frowning at whatever she saw there, and the second agent had crossed his arms and said something about outstanding warrants and prior removals, and Mateo had realized with a sick, sinking feeling that they weren't talking about him. They were talking about someone else, someone who shared his name, maybe his birthday, some overlapping thread in a system that didn't care about the difference. He'd tried to explain. He'd given him his social security number, recited his address, named his elementary school and the street he'd grown up on. He'd told them about his mother, who died when he was 17, and the apartment he rented near the community college where he sometimes took night classes. But the agents had only exchanged a look, and one of them had made a phone call, and then Mateo had been put in handcuffs, not tight, but real, and let out through the back entrance where none of his coworkers could see. The detention center had been worse. Concrete floors, fluorescent lights that never shut off, the smell of industrial cleaner and fear. Mateo had been put in a holding cell with 11 other men, most of them silent, a few talking in low, rapid Spanish about lawyers and bonds and the chances of getting released. He'd tried to stay calm. He'd asked for a phone call, for a lawyer, for anyone who could pull up the right records and see that this was a mistake. But the hours had bled together, and every time someone came to the door it was to call a different name, and Mateo had felt himself disappearing into the system like water soaking into sand. On the 3rd day they'd told him he was being removed, not deported, removed, as if he were a stain or an obstruction. He'd been given a plastic bag with his wallet, his keys, and a photocopy of a document he didn't recognize, some intake form with a case number that meant nothing to him, and then he'd been loaded into the van with 6 other men, and the door had shut, and the desert had started rolling past the window in shades of brown and gray. Now, sitting in a concrete room in Nogales, Sonora, Mateo stared at the photocopy in his hands and tried to make sense of it. The print was smudged, the edges torn. There was a name at the top, his name, but the details underneath were wrong. Wrong birthday, wrong place of birth, wrong everything. He folded it carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket, the only thing he had that might prove anything, even though he knew it wouldn't. Not here, not on this side of the border. The other men from the van had scattered. Some had family waiting. Some had disappeared into the narrow streets beyond the processing center. Mateo had walked until he found a bench near a bus station, and he'd sat there as the sun set, watching people move past him with purpose and direction, and he'd felt more alone than he ever had in his life. He had no passport, no ID that would work here, no money except the $43 in his wallet, and no clear way to prove, from this side of the line, that he'd been born on the other. He thought about his apartment. The lease was in his name. His bills were in his name. His birth certificate was in a file box under his bed, next to his high school diploma and the program from his mother's funeral. All of it unreachable now, locked away in a country that had just told him he didn't belong. A woman walked past pushing a stroller, and a man selling elote called out from a corner cart, and Mateo closed his eyes and tried to remember the exact layout of his apartment, the way the morning light came through the kitchen window, the sound of his neighbor's TV through the wall. He tried to hold on to it, every detail, because he didn't know how long it would take to get back or if he ever would. By the time the stars came out, he'd made a plan. It wasn't much. Find a place to stay, find work, find a way to contact someone who could help. But it was something. He stood, shouldered his jacket, and walked toward the lights of the town carrying nothing but a photocopy and the stubborn, quiet belief that the truth had to matter eventually. It had to. The shelter was run by a woman named Sister Lucia, who handed Mateo a bowl of pozole and a blanket without asking any questions. The room was crowded, cots lined up in rows, families huddled together, children asleep on makeshift beds of folded jackets. Mateo found a corner near the back and sat with his back against the wall, the bowl warm in his hands, and he ate slowly, tasting nothing. He stayed for 3 days. During the day, he walked the streets looking for work, asking at restaurants and construction sites and anywhere that might pay cash. At night, he returned to the shelter and lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling and running through every step that had led him here. The audit, the agents, the room with no windows, the van, the border. Each moment sharp and clear, like a sequence of photographs he couldn't stop flipping through. On the 4th day, Sister Lucia sat down beside him during breakfast and slid a piece of paper across the table. It had a name on it, Elena Ruiz, and an address in Tucson. "She helps people like you," Sister Lucia said quietly. "Americans who've been deported by mistake. It happens more than you'd think." Mateo looked at the paper, then at the nun. "How do I contact her from here?" Sister Lucia pulled out a cell phone, old and scratched, and handed it to him. "Call. Tell her I sent you. She'll know what to do." The call went to voicemail. Mateo left a message, his voice steadier than he felt, explaining who he was and what had happened. He thanked Sister Lucia, returned the phone, and went back to looking for work, expecting nothing. But 2 days later, the phone rang at the shelter, and Sister Lucia came to find him, holding the receiver out with a small, hopeful smile. Elena Ruiz had a voice like gravel smoothed by water, low and calm and certain. She asked him questions, direct, specific, and Mateo answered each one, feeling something loosen in his chest with every detail he gave. She didn't sound surprised. She didn't sound doubtful. She sounded like someone who had heard this story before and knew exactly how to unravel it. "I'm going to need proof," she said. "Your birth certificate. Any documents you have in your apartment. Can you tell me who has keys?" Mateo thought of his landlord, a man named Frank, who lived 2 buildings over and fixed the plumbing himself to save money. "I can give you his number." "Good. I'll contact him. In the meantime, I'm filing an emergency motion with the court. It's going to take time, Mateo, weeks, maybe longer. But if what you're telling me is true, we'll get you home." The word home hit him like a physical thing, and he had to close his eyes and breathe through the ache in his throat before he could speak again. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Elena said. "This system doesn't fix itself quickly, but I'll do everything I can." After the call ended, Mateo handed the phone back to Sister Lucia and walked outside into the afternoon heat. The street smelled like grilled meat and exhaust, and somewhere a radio was playing a song he half remembered from childhood. He leaned against the shelter's wall and let himself feel, for the first time since the van door had closed, a fragile thread of hope. Work came in pieces, a day unloading trucks at a market, 2 days painting a fence, a week washing dishes at a restaurant near the bus station. Mateo took every job, saved every peso, and kept his head down. He didn't talk much, didn't make friends, didn't let himself think past the next task. But at night, lying on his cot, he let himself imagine the moment he'd cross back over, the moment he'd walk into his apartment and lock the door behind him and know that no one could take it away again. Elena called every few days with updates. She'd reached Frank, She'd retrieved the birth certificate, she'd filed motions, requested hearings, contacted immigration officials. Each step felt impossibly small, but Mateo clung to them, marking time by her calls, by the slow forward motion of a system that had crushed him without thinking, and now, maybe, might lift him back up. One evening, a man at the shelter asked him why he looked so tense all the time, and Mateo had realized he didn't know how to explain it, the way it felt to be erased, to have your entire life dismissed as a lie, to know that the country you'd been born in had shrugged and pushed you out like you'd never existed. So he had just said he was waiting for something, and the man had nodded and gone back to his meal, and Mateo had sat there feeling the weight of all the things he couldn't say. But the hope stayed, fragile, stubborn, growing a little stronger every time Elena's number appeared on Sister Lucia's phone. The call came on a Tuesday morning in April. Mateo was at the market, stacking crates of avocados, when Sister Lucia appeared at the edge of the loading dock, waving the phone. He climbed down, wiped his hands on his jeans, and took the call, his heart already racing. "We have a hearing," Elena said. "Next week, in Tucson. The judge agreed to review your case." Mateo pressed the phone harder against his ear, afraid he'd misheard. "I can come back?" "Not yet. The hearing is to determine your status. If it goes well, yes, you'll be allowed to return. But you need to be there, Mateo, in person." "How do I—" He stopped, the logistics crashing into him all at once. He had no passport, no legal way to cross. "How do I get there?" Elena's voice softened. "I'm working on it. There's a process for cases like this. Humanitarian parole, emergency entry. It's not guaranteed, but I'm filing the request today. In the meantime, get to the port of entry in Nogales this Friday at 8 in the morning. Bring your photocopy, your wallet, anything with your name on it. I'll meet you there." The call ended, and Mateo stood in the middle of the loading dock, the sun beating down on his shoulders, and he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Not just hope, but the real, concrete possibility of an ending that didn't break him. He worked the rest of the week in a daze, his mind spinning through every scenario, every way the hearing could go. At night, he rehearsed what he'd say, how he'd explain the mistake, how he'd prove he was telling the truth. He pictured the judge, imagined the room, tried to prepare himself for the moment when everything would either fall into place or collapse completely. Friday morning, he walked to the port of entry as the sun rose, the streets still cool and quiet. The crossing was a sprawl of concrete and chain link, lines of cars inching forward, pedestrians queued under metal canopies. Mateo joined the line, his stomach tight, his hands shoved in his pockets to keep them from shaking. Elena found him an hour later. She was shorter than he'd imagined, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a bun and eyes that looked like they'd seen every version of this story and refused to stop fighting. She shook his hand, checked his documents, and led him to a side office where a uniformed officer reviewed his case file with the kind of slow, methodical attention that made Mateo's chest ache with suspense. Finally, the officer stamped a paper and handed it to Elena. "He can enter, temporary, for the hearing only." Mateo felt his knees almost buckle. Elena gripped his arm, steadying him, and said, "Let's go." The crossing took 20 minutes. Mateo walked through the gates, stepped on U.S. soil, and felt the ground beneath him shift, like something fundamental had realigned. Elena drove him to her office, a cramped space above a travel agency, and they spent the afternoon going over every detail of his case. Dates, documents, witness statements from coworkers who remembered him, records from his high school, bills from his apartment. She made copies, organized folders, rehearsed questions he might be asked. "You're going to be fine," she said as the sun set outside her window. "The evidence is clear. The mistake is documented. The judge will see it." But Mateo couldn't shake the memory of the agents who hadn't listened, the system that had swallowed him without looking. But what if they don't? Elena met his eyes, her expression firm. "Then we appeal, and we keep appealing. But I don't think we'll have to." The hearing was held in a federal building downtown,
a room with wood paneling and fluorescent lights, and a judge who looked tired before the session even started. Mateo sat at a table beside Elena, his hands folded in his lap, and watched as she presented the case, his birth certificate, his social security card, his school records, photos of him as a child in Phoenix, testimony from Frank the landlord, statements from his former employer. Piece by piece, she rebuilt his life in front of the court, methodical and relentless, until the evidence was so overwhelming that even Mateo, who'd lived it, felt the weight of it. The judge asked him questions: where he was born, where he went to school, what he remembered about his mother. He answered each one, his voice quiet but steady, and he watched the judge's face for any sign of belief, any flicker of recognition. And then, after what felt like hours, the judge leaned back and said, "The deportation order is vacated. Mr. Reyes is a U.S. citizen. He's free to return home." The room went silent. Mateo heard the words, but it took a moment for them to land, to become real. Elena touched his shoulder, and he turned to look at her, and she was smiling, her eyes bright, and he realized with a sudden, overwhelming rush that it was over. He'd won. He was home.
The apartment smelled stale when Mateo unlocked the door, like air that had been sitting too long. He stepped inside, set his keys on the counter, and stood in the middle of the living room, taking in the familiar shapes: the couch, the bookshelf, the window with the crooked blinds. Everything exactly as he'd left it, nothing the same. Frank had kept the place up, watered the plants, made sure the bills were paid from Mateo's account, but there were gaps now, pieces of his life that had slipped away in the months he'd been gone. His job at the warehouse was filled, his phone had been disconnected, his mail was stacked on the kitchen table, most of it notices and warnings and automated reminders that felt like echoes of a life he'd almost lost. He spent the first week putting things back together. He called the phone company, updated his address, contacted his old supervisor to see if there were any openings. There weren't. The warehouse had moved on. He was a name in an old payroll file, nothing more. But Elena knew people. She made calls, sent emails, and within 2 weeks Mateo had an interview at a nonprofit that helped formerly incarcerated people find work. The job was simple: intake coordinator, data entry, scheduling, but it was steady, and it came with health insurance, and the woman who hired him, a former public defender named Grace, shook his hand and said, "We need people who understand how the system can fail. Welcome aboard." The work was different from the warehouse, quieter, more about listening than doing. Mateo met people every day who'd been caught in the gears of bureaucracy, who'd lost years to mistakes and oversights and the kind of indifference that crushed lives without noticing. He listened to their stories, helped them fill out forms, connected them with resources, and he found a strange, unexpected comfort in it. The idea that his own disaster might mean something, might help someone else navigate the same maze. One afternoon in June, a man came in who'd been deported for a traffic violation that had been dismissed, but the dismissal had never been entered into the system. Mateo sat with him for 2 hours, pulling records, making calls, walking him through every step. And when the man finally left with a stack of documents and a court date that might change everything, he shook Mateo's hand and said, "Thank you. I didn't think anyone would believe me." Mateo watched him go, and he thought about the agents who hadn't listened, the judge who had, the months in Nogales when belief had felt impossible. He thought about Elena, who'd fought because she'd heard too many stories like his to stop fighting. And he thought about the man in the van beside him, crying into his sleeve, and wondered if he'd ever made it home. That evening, he walked to the community center where Elena ran a legal clinic every Thursday night. The room was crowded. Families sitting in folding chairs, kids doing homework at the back tables, volunteers handing out pamphlets in English and Spanish. Mateo found Elena at the front desk, reviewing a case file, and he waited until she looked up. "I want to help, here, at the clinic, however I can." Elena studied him for a moment, then nodded. "We could use someone at intake, someone who knows what it feels like to be on the other side." So, Mateo started volunteering. 1 night a week, then 2. He took people's information, listened to their stories, helped them understand what came next. He wasn't a lawyer, couldn't give legal advice, but he could sit with them and say, "I've been there. I know how hard this is, but there are people who will fight for you."
And sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that made the difference between someone giving up and someone holding on long enough to find help. The months passed. Summer turned to fall and the heat broke, and Mateo started taking night classes again, picking up where he'd left off before the audit. He didn't have a grand plan, just a vague sense that he wanted to understand the system better, wanted to know how to keep it from swallowing people whole. He took a class on immigration law, another on social work, and he sat in the back of the classroom and filled notebooks with ideas and questions and the slow, stubborn determination to make sure no one else disappeared the way he had. One evening in October, Grace stopped by his desk at the nonprofit and handed him a folder. She said, "New case, woman in her 60s, deported 20 years ago, trying to come back for her daughter's wedding. It's complicated. Thought you might have some insight." Mateo opened the folder and read the first page, and he felt the familiar ache in his chest, the old anger mixed with something sharper now, purpose, maybe, or just the refusal to let the system win. He looked up at Grace and nodded. "I'll take it." The weeks blurred together after that. Work, classes, the clinic, late nights reviewing case files, early mornings on the phone with lawyers and officials, and anyone who might help. Mateo was tired most days, the kind of tired that settled deep in his bones, but it was a different kind of exhaustion than the helpless, suffocating weight he'd carried in Nogales. This was the tiredness of building something, of pushing back against the machinery that had tried to erase him. And in the quiet moments, Sunday mornings when he sat on his couch with coffee and watched the light come through the window, or Friday nights at the clinic when someone left with hope they hadn't had when they walked in, he let himself feel something he hadn't expected to find again. Not happiness exactly, but the beginning of it, the foundation. One evening in early November, Elena called him into her office. She closed the door, gestured for him to sit, and slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a letter from the Department of Homeland Security, an official acknowledgement of the error in his case, an apology for the wrongful deportation, and a settlement offer that made Mateo's head spin. He stared at the number, then looked up at her. "This is real?" "It's real. It's not enough. It'll never be enough for what they took from you, but it's something, and it's yours." Mateo folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his pocket. He thought about the bench in Nogales, the shelter, the months of waiting. He thought about the man in the van and made a decision. "I want to use it. For the clinic, for cases like mine." Elena's expression softened, and she leaned back in her chair, a small, tired smile on her face. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," Mateo said. And he was.
The morning of the anniversary, 1 year since the hearing, since the judge had said the words that gave him his life back, Mateo woke early and made pancakes. Not because it was special, but because it had become his ritual, a small act of reclaiming normalcy. He stacked them on a plate, poured syrup in a slow spiral, and sat at his kitchen table, eating slowly and watching the light shift across the floor. His phone buzzed. A message from Grace. "Client meeting at 10. She's nervous. Bring pancakes?" Mateo smiled. He wrapped a few in foil, grabbed his jacket, and headed out. The client was a young woman named Sofia, 18, born in California, raised in Mexico after her parents were deported when she was 3. She wanted to come home, wanted to finish high school, wanted to live in the country she'd been born in but barely remembered. Mateo sat with her in the clinic's back room, spread out her documents, and walked her through every step. She asked questions, her voice shaking, and Mateo answered each one with the kind of patience he wished someone had shown him. "It's going to take time," he said. "But you're not alone. We're going to fight for you." Sofia looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed, and nodded. "You really think I can come back?" Mateo thought about the van, the border, the months in Nogales. He thought about the judge who'd listened, Elena who'd fought, Frank who'd kept his apartment safe. He thought about all the people who'd believed him when the system hadn't, and he met Sofia's eyes and said, "Yes, I do." After she left, Mateo stood in the clinic's lobby and looked around at the walls covered in resource posters, the tables stacked with pamphlets, the people waiting for help. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough. But it was something. And it was growing.
That evening, he met Elena for coffee at the diner near the community center. She ordered pie, and they sat in a booth by the window, talking about cases and strategies and the 100 small ways the system could still break people if they weren't careful. But there was something lighter in her voice now, a cautious optimism that hadn't been there a year ago. "You've done good work," she said, setting down her fork. "Really good work." Mateo shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I'm just helping." "It's more than that," Elena said. "You're proof that the system can be beaten. That matters." They talked for another hour until the diner started emptying and the waitress began wiping down tables. When they finally left, Mateo walked home through streets that felt familiar again. Streets that belonged to him because he'd earned them back, inch by painful inch. At home, he sat at his desk and opened his laptop, pulling up the essay he'd been writing for one of his classes, a reflection on citizenship and belonging and what it meant to be erased and rebuilt. He typed slowly, the words coming easier now than they had months ago. Each sentence a small act of reclaiming his voice. He wrote about the audit, the van, the border, the shelter, Elena, the hearing, the rebuilding. And he wrote about Sophia and all the others like her, and the stubborn, necessary belief that the truth mattered, that people mattered, that mistakes could be corrected if enough people cared to fight. When he finished, he saved the file and closed the laptop, and he sat for a moment in the quiet of his apartment, feeling the weight of the year settle around him, not heavy, but solid, real, earned. The next morning, he woke early again and made pancakes. He ate at his kitchen table, watching the light shift, and he thought about the life he'd almost lost and the life he was building now, piece by careful piece. It wasn't the same, it would never be the same, but it was his, and no one could take it away again. And when his phone buzzed with a message from Grace, "New case, can you come in early?" he grabbed his jacket, locked the door behind him, and headed out into the morning, carrying the quiet, stubborn certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be.